All right. Hi, guys. Mallory here. So a little stuffy. The allergies over here are just out of control. So I am doing my presentation on generalized anxiety disorder, and we'll just get right to it. Maybe. There we go. All right. So to begin, a little background on history. Beginning in the 19th century, before generalized anxiety disorder became its own diagnosis, it went through a little bit of a process of trying to kind of discover itself. And the first real kind of citing was what was considered pantophobia or panophobia, which basically had Latin roots of all fearing. And this was a bit of an extreme interpretation of some of the symptomology. Essentially, it was just saying that they were, someone was afraid of anything, of a mouse, of anything, which is obviously kind of more of a phobias category. And then it moved down to neurasthenia, which was originally presented by Freud. And this was basically just a disease that was vaguely defined. And so they were taking all of these different symptoms and uncertain of what to call it. They were kind of shifting it to this category. And then Freud, another ingenious interpretation of sexual motive function from Freud here. He described this as anxiety neuroses, and essentially it was sort of an anxious expectation related to like a sexual experience. So you would have all the anticipation and the buildup, but then not the actual coming. And then in 1980, for the third edition of the DSM-5, they finally revised all of the anxiety disorders into the separate generalized anxiety disorder category and the panic disorder category. And this was due to a difference in the medication response. So panic disorder, individuals that experience panic disorder, they responded to the antidepressants, whereas the generalized anxiety disorder did not. And then the measure of the GAD-7 came out. And this was later on, but it was really the first kind of defined or reliable measurement tool for the to measure what they had considered within the diagnostic criteria. But we'll talk more about that moving forward. So symptomology, it was really difficult to establish the separate GAD diagnosis because it's hard to distinguish between what was considered everyday worrying and pathological worry. And part of this was due to the fact that there was so much change that was occurring in the way that they defined the diagnosis. And so because of that, it was difficult to measure. And the other issue is that there's a lot of overlapping somatic and cognitive symptoms. And so with that, there's, you'll see many of these same symptoms being expressed in the other diagnoses, other personality, anxiety, and even the unipolar. So just a separate depressive disorder. You'll see some of these same symptoms. So it can become difficult. Another study a study that I wanted to bring in by Moffitt and et al. This study was pretty important and useful for the research and understanding of this diagnosis, because they did a longitudinal study where they took and followed individuals throughout many years of their life, starting in like earlier birthing time all the way up until age 32. And they had a really high retention rate as well. So a lot of they were able to maintain those that research with the same individuals. And what they found, which was pretty important, was that in cases where individuals were under the diagnostic criteria of both a generalized anxiety disorder and a major depressive disorder, they had the same risk factors as those that just had the generalized anxiety alone, but not the same as those that had the major depressive disorder alone. And so what this means is that it's inferring that the generalizing anxiety disorder comes after a major depressive disorder. So individuals that have the major depressive disorder are now at a higher risk of getting the generalized anxiety disorder. So eventually, they were able to arrive at some of the defining symptoms of this specific diagnosis, and that includes a chronic and pathological worry over a number of things. So a number of different domains, work, home life, and so you have to see these things occurring across different contexts, and that the worry, it's like a persistent, regular fear. Irrational fear is kind of the important thing there. Something that there's no immediate threat. 4 more of a whole variety of different symptoms that are both somatic and cognitive, including restlessness, fatigue, impaired concentration, irritability, muscle tension, and sleep disturbances. And then the symptoms need to exist for at least a 6-month duration or longer. And then they're not better explained by another clinical and medical disorder. And so I talked about that in the previous slide about how there's a lot of overlapping symptoms. And so you do need to rule out whether or not it's not better explained by one of those other diagnoses. So the prevalence rates, globally, according to the World Health Organization, it's about a 3.6% rate. It is the highest and most common psychiatric disorder that we know of, with depression being, right there with it. And women are actually twice as likely to, or at least have been reported as twice as likely to be diagnosed with this. And so you're looking at 4.6 female, 2.6 male. In the US, the rates are about 7% for females and 4% for males. And so obviously we're seeing a little bit higher than the global rate there. And 90% of individuals that have the diagnoses also have another comorbid disorder, for instance, substance abuse or depression. A study by Avison Naqvi, which it was an epidemiological study that looked at a lot of neuroimaging research. They found a lot of variation across different countries, but mostly they all kind of stayed within the 2 to 10% range. Their numbers were a little bit all over the place, and I did quite a bit of research into different sites for prevalence rates, and we were looking, a lot of them tended to be a little bit lower than this upwards of 10%. But these guys also reported that in Pakistan, the rates were close to 30%. So it seems like there's a lot of uncertain variation in the way that they're recording prevalence rates. But I'm going to go with the World Health Organization and say that it's going to be around, the 3.5% to 4% ranges. So the Moffat et al. Study, again, this was the longitudinal study. They found that the most common risk factors were adverse family environment, so specifically a low socioeconomic status, and then some maltreatment. And so those kind of go hand in hand, living, in poverty. Childhood behavior as well. So the main emphasis on this was the maternal internalizing. So essentially, the mom's way of handling and dealing with emotional or affect, and the way that they express that, that gets passed down to the child, which in turn can lead to conduct problems and also potentially inhibited temperament from the child. So I think that the inhibited temperament can be both biological, because I think that there are certain qualities of DNA that do, have children, express temperament in different ways. That's not directly linked to potential stress or birthing, habits. However, It could also be affected by a mom or a caregiver's temperament, and if they're likely to internalize or whatnot, or take away from a child's ability to express their temperament authentically. And then other factors were receiving mental health services. So those that did receive mental health services were, I guess those were protective factors. And then psychiatric, whether or not they were receiving psychiatric medication, which as a risk factor can go both ways. Abbas and Nafki, they describe a lot of the psychiatric medication effects, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the other factor is negative emotionality. And this is basically, optimism versus pessimism, whether or not someone has more of a tendency to kind of view the world in a negative or more positive way, definitely affects, whether or not they end up with the generalized anxiety disorder. So Abbas and Nafki, they did the neuroimaging. They looked into a lot of the neuroimaging research, which I would love to talk about in a lot greater detail, but I'm not going to, I guess, for the purposes of keeping this relatively condensed. But essentially, they were looking at differences in brain regions for those that were affected with this disorder. So epidemiological research is looking for the cause, and then the neuroimaging is kind of looking at the here and now and trying to uncover what's going on in the brain for those that have the disorder versus those that don't. And there's quite a bit of findings there, specifically regarding the amygdala, so the fear part of the brain that deals with our fear response and emotions, and so a lot of that is affected. And so some of the risk factors that are involved here is that alcohol abuse can certainly affect one's risk of getting the disorder, but also once you start mixing medications and then you look at medication response, putting someone on the medication and then taking them off of it can actually increase symptoms. And, one's tendency towards alcohol abuse is very similar to kind of the way that they may respond to medication. And so all of that needs to be considered. And then lastly, if a parent suffers from an anxiety-related disorder, then children are much more likely to get it then as well. Portman looked at risk factors and also found that the low socioeconomic status was definitely a factor, and then women's marital status as well. So women who are either married or not married are at less of a risk versus those that have been married, divorced, or married, widowed. And then also, again, women are twice as likely as men to be diagnosed. And some of the possibilities or possible explanations are cultural pressures. So, women have, I think, more of an expectation in society to, take on multiple roles, mother, the career, the wife, and also more of an expectation to for like emotional labor, so kind of keeping the peace, and hormonal differences, as well as just higher reporting rates. So there's also, social, it's more socially accepted for women, particularly in the US, to report, or to help these help-seeking behaviors. So methods for arriving at a diagnosis. There are quite a few different ways that this can be done, but the most important thing is that a lot of the symptoms are shown to be somatic, and that means that they're expressed cardiovascularly, through the digestive expression, and respiratory. And so it can be difficult to arrive at a proper diagnosis. So the first thing is that you're going to want to eliminate any physical health problems, so physical examinations and tests. The second is to assess and rule out any other possible disorders, like we talked about earlier, any mood or personality disorders, and those, stated in the DSM-5. I talked about this throughout the slides, but the clinical assessments can definitely be kind of difficult with this, just because there's been limited reliable scales to assess for generalized anxiety disorder. And GAD-7 was really the first one that offered a nice, reliable measurement that was more, somewhat culturally sensitive and specific. According to the DSM-5, in action, Zagilowski, I don't think I've had to say that yet. Suggest, or, according to the DSM-5, so this is clearly like, the methods for not universally, but the recommended methods, right, is to focus on helping the client arrive at the top 3 concerns and address them individually. So this is a great way of trying to distinguish between the different diagnoses. So this is, using essentially a structured interview to do this. It can be easily confused with agoraphobia, so not wanting to leave the home. So that's something that you'll want to consider. You want to assess for different contextual circumstances. So like whether or not, you're seeing these same sort of symptoms being expressed across different relationships, different environments, and different situations, and how they're being expressed and how this is impacting their life across these different circumstances. And then most importantly, assessing for the cultural relevance and how this plays into this particular client's interpretation of the disorder or of their symptoms. And that brings me to my next slide. So Abbas and Naqvi found that the cost of care differs across different countries, and this is something that I want to consider when it comes to help-seeking behaviors and the prevalence rates and whatnot. And, that's just the nature of it. There are going to be countries that, regardless of the fact that, like in Pakistan, very high rates, but it's difficult to still, get every person care because it's expensive. And Dragons and Tanaku Matsumi, they had a very, very long, although somewhat outdated study research. They brought in a whole bunch of different research across all different cultures to try to understand, the cross-cultural somatization and just basically understanding of different symptomology and how we define mental illness and what that looks like. And what they found was that there's a huge emphasis on cross-cultural, across cultures, there's a much larger emphasis on somatic symptoms than there are on a lot of cognitive symptoms, where in traditional Western psychotherapy, the symptoms tend to be a lot more focused on cognition. And so that was something that they emphasized a lot. And I think that we've come a long way, but still something to consider. So the somatization of symptoms is a lot more common in Japan, India, Latin America, and Africa. So it makes up a huge portion of the world. And I just pulled a quote that says, traditionally in China, psychological symptoms were not regarded as problems that would justify seeking help from health professionals. So this is something that's important to consider when you think about the stigma that's attached to seeking, psychotherapy intervention. But also the way that they interpret, what's happening, and whether they believe that that's something that requires attention. So some of the same things here is that for Marcus and Robinaugh, they found that first, the U.S. Definitely shows one of the highest prevalence rates. In fact, twice as likely than many other countries to have the generalized anxiety diagnoses. And that includes ethnic groups that are living inside the U.S. So immigrants or even just U.S.-born Mexican Americans. They still have lower rates. And part of this might be due to the fact that, like I pulled a quote here from this study or from this paper, that anxiety and worry of ethnic minorities may be more likely to be deemed appropriate owing to difficulties arising from low socioeconomic status and infiltration stress. So basically, when you look at the criteria and the DSM for this diagnosis, one of the first points to consider is whether this is not only debilitating, but whether that's an excessive worry, something that's wouldn't be rationalized given a person's situation. And in a lot of low socioeconomic status and whatnot, you're looking at those that are experiencing anxiety and worry over real life situations that that would be appropriate. And so, the fear, the irrational fear is kind of a big piece in this. And so that'd be important to consider. So recommended evidence-based treatment modalities in the DSM in action, a lot of the treatment planning focuses on cognitive behavioral techniques. So CBT therapy, identifying irrational cognition, stressors, triggers, and then using like mindfulness techniques and relaxation techniques. The other recommendation is building really strong interpersonal skills and strategies due to the fact that this can put a huge strain on relationships. And so interpersonal type theory or therapies be really important here. Abbas and Naqvi, they talk also about using client-centered, supportive, expressive, rational emotive, and CBT techniques. They don't talk a lot about these in a lot of detail, but rational emotive and CBT are pretty similar techniques. Both of them are designed to identify, the irrational cognitions, to understand connections between emotion, behavior, and cognition, and kind of breaking, interjecting that cycle or in those mechanisms and being able to identify, cause and to identify triggers and work on those one at a time to break those down. The difference between the two is that with rational emotive, it's a little bit more past, or CBT is a lot more present focused, whereas with rational emotive, you're looking more at the cause. So it has more of an ideological motivation, I guess, looking at, this happened, so why? Whereas CBT is not as concerned with that. They just want to focus on, present focus. And then the other, recommended treatment is medication. And the most common are SSRIs, SNRIs, antidepressants, sometimes antipsychotics, depending on the severity, and how distressing or debilitating the disorder is on an individual's life. Also want to consider comorbid disorders here with medication, like some of the stuff that we talked about earlier and some of those medication effects. Yeah. I just wanted to include one more slide here, and it's not incredibly positive, but it's important. So the prognosis is not great. This is a disorder that tends to occur in a very slow and gradual way. And so, even though the initial onset tends to occur in earlier adolescence, it's not generally around age 30 that people seek treatment for it, and that the symptoms are the most apparent or it becomes the most debilitating for people to deal with. And at this point, it can be a lot more difficult to, you know, to get the help needed because you've been so, you've been reinforcing these cognitive, you know, these patterns for so long that can be difficult to break that. So the important thing is prevention, you know, being able to identify this early, and that comes down to giving people the access to care that they need, and, you know, and prevention. So yeah, that's it. I didn't want to include too much on this. I imagine we all have our own stories, and I think that I am getting a little bit of a theme here with all of us in this program so far from everyone that I've met, that we all have common stories around mental illness, and I think that's part of what drives us into this field. Anxiety has been incredibly debilitating disorder for me in my life, specifically in the last few years. And, you know, it does kind of wax and wane, but most of the time it's there. And, you know, the last couple of days have not been great days for me. So, I mean, even this in itself has been kind of a challenge. And, you know, I know the effects well. And it's sad to see, you know, this slide, to know that, you know, in my case, I definitely did experience that, where, you know, it seems like you're working on things throughout the time and you're getting somewhere, but it's not until it's so bad that you realize that, you know, it's caught up to you. All these, you know, it's definitely slow and gradual. So I'm not huge on pathologizing in general, and this class has been something that I'm really trying to work through. But it definitely has, you know, shed a lot of light on me that treatment is so important, and that there's so much that can be done by seeking treatment. And so I do believe in that, of course, because otherwise I wouldn't be going into this field. But there are a lot of factors at play here, and there's a lot that you have to dig through, and the DSM-5 is a great tool for that. And yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed learning a little bit about this disorder, and I'm sure you're going to learn more about it moving forward. I will say on a last note that this specific disorder was not like really laid out very clearly, at least in the DSM in action. And so there wasn't a lot I was able to pull from that. Like there isn't like a section necessarily on that. It's very brief. So just something I noticed. But anyways, thanks guys.